It started as an ordinary day in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There were no warnings, no arguments, no final goodbyes. One member of a local family went about their routine and simply never came home. At first, no one panicked. People ran late, plans changed. Tulsa in the early 1970s was a growing city, busy but familiar, the kind of place where routines felt dependable. But when night came and there was still no sign of them, concern settled in. By the following morning, concern turned into fear. A missing person report was filed. Police arrived, asked questions, wrote notes, and reassured the family that many disappearances ended with safe returns. Adults left town sometimes. Stress, relationships, money, these were common explanations at the time. The family listened, but something felt wrong. Their loved one had left without personal belongings, without money, without explanation. There was no phone call, no message, no indication of a planned departure, just silence. Police searched nearby areas, spoke to neighbors, and attempted to retrace the last known movements. There was no abandoned car, no confirmed sighting, no evidence of violence. Without a crime scene or physical proof, the case stalled quickly. Days passed, then weeks. The family began calling police themselves, asking for updates, offering ideas, reminding officers of details that felt important to them. Some leads were checked. None went anywhere. What made the situation unbearable was not knowing what had happened. Death, at least, brings certainty. Disappearance leaves a wound that never closes. As months passed, Tulsa continued its normal rhythm. Streets filled with traffic. Businesses opened and closed. People moved on. But for one household, time froze. Holidays came and went. Birthdays passed without celebration. Each unanswered year added weight to the same question. How does someone vanish without a trace? By the late 1970s, the investigation slowed almost completely. The case was not closed, but it was no longer active. Officers changed. Records were archived. Witness memories faded. This is how cold cases form, not through indifference, but through the slow erosion of momentum. The family refused to let the name disappear. They kept photographs safe. They wrote letters. They followed rumors. They listened closely whenever someone mentioned the past. Occasionally, someone would say they remembered something strange from that night. A car parked where it shouldn't have been. A sound that didn't make sense at the time. A person whose behavior felt off in hindsight. None of it could be proven. Years turned into decades. Parents aged. Some passed away without answers. Siblings carried the story forward, explaining it to children who had never met the person at the center of it all. Tulsa changed. Neighborhoods were rebuilt. Empty land was developed. Places tied to the past were erased by progress. But the family never accepted that silence meant the truth was gone. They believed someone knew what happened. Someone had seen something. Someone had stayed quiet. By the early 2000s, the disappearance had been unresolved for nearly 30 years. Most cold cases never make it that far in public memory. This one survived because the family refused to stop asking. They didn't ask for revenge, they asked for truth. They wanted to know whether their loved one had suffered, whether it had been an accident, whether it had been intentional, whether it could have been prevented. Most of all, they wanted confirmation that the disappearance mattered. As the case approached its 50th year, it seemed unlikely that answers would ever come. Witnesses were elderly. Evidence was gone. The world had moved on. But time has a strange effect on secrets. And after nearly half a century, something finally shifted. The renewed attention did not come with headlines or announcements. It began quietly, the way most long-buried truths do. Someone spoke. Not publicly, not dramatically, but seriously enough that authorities listened. Information surfaced that had not been formally documented decades earlier. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't physical evidence. It was memory, imperfect, delayed, but persistent. Investigators reopened the file. This time, the approach was different. Modern detectives reviewed old reports digitally. They reconstructed timelines using technology that did not exist in the 1970s. They compared this disappearance to similar cases, looking for patterns that might have been missed. They returned to locations that no longer looked the same. Fields had become buildings. Roads had shifted. Entire neighborhoods had been transformed. But human behavior leaves traces that time cannot fully erase. Authorities spoke again with surviving witnesses. Some details changed. Some became clearer. Others confirmed long-held suspicions. The family was contacted and informed that investigators no longer believed the disappearance was voluntary. While no suspect could be named and no charges guaranteed, officials acknowledged that a crime was the most likely explanation. For the family, that acknowledgement mattered. It didn't bring relief. It didn't bring closure. But it validated decades of waiting. They understood the limits of justice after 50 years. They knew that arrests were unlikely. Evidence may never meet legal standards. But they also knew that truth does not require a courtroom to exist. The case remains unsolved, but it is no longer invisible. It is documented. It is recognized. It stands as part of Tulsa's history, not as a rumor, but as an unresolved truth. The family continues to remember, to speak the name, to tell the story. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time. In reality, they are carried by families, by memory, by questions that refuse to fade. Some stories end with answers, others end with persistence, and some never truly end at all. By the time the case reached its 5th decade, it had outlived almost everyone who originally touched it. The officers who first took the report were retired or gone. Early witnesses were elderly or deceased. Entire neighborhoods connected to the disappearance had been demolished and rebuilt. What remained was not evidence, but memory, fragile, incomplete, and shaped by time. Yet the case continued to exist because the family continued to speak its name. They understood something many people don't. Cold cases don't disappear because the truth is gone. They disappear because attention fades, and attention is something families have to fight for. As the years passed, the family learned how systems work. They learned how investigations are prioritized, how resources are allocated, and how easily unresolved cases slip into the background. They learned that silence is not always intentional. Sometimes it is simply procedural. But procedure does not comfort grief. The family began documenting everything themselves. They kept timelines. They recorded conversations. They noted names of officers, dates of calls, and details of each interaction. They did what they could to preserve the story in case the official record failed. In many ways, they became the custodians of the case. Tulsa, meanwhile, continued to grow. New residents arrived with no knowledge of what had happened decades earlier. The disappearance became a footnote, if it was remembered at all. But every city carries quiet histories beneath its surface, stories that don't show up on maps, questions that linger in places no longer marked. The family believed the truth was still somewhere in Tulsa, not hidden in evidence, but in people. They believed someone had lived with knowledge for years, someone who had told themselves it was too late to matter, someone who assumed the past would stay buried. Time, however, changes that assumption. As people age, priorities shift. Regret grows heavier. Silence becomes harder to justify. And sometimes, truth finds a way out, not because it is forced, but because it is finally released. When investigators revisited the case in later years, they did so cautiously. They knew the limits. They understood that reopening old wounds could raise expectations they might not be able to fulfill. They did not promise answers. They promised effort. They reviewed archived reports line by line. They examined what had been documented and what had not. They noted where assumptions had replaced certainty, where leads had been dismissed because they lacked immediate clarity. They also noted something important. The absence of evidence had been treated as evidence of absence. That mindset had shaped the case from the beginning. Modern investigators no longer worked that way. They understood that lack of evidence often reflects lack of opportunity, lack of technology, or lack of urgency, not lack of wrongdoing. The family was told, carefully and honestly, that while a definitive resolution might never come, the case now stood differently than it once had. It was no longer seen as a disappearance without explanation. It was treated as a likely crime. That distinction mattered. It meant the story would not fade quietly. It meant the record would reflect doubt instead of dismissal. It meant the family's insistence had not been in vain. For them, justice was never just about arrests. It was about recognition. They wanted their loved one's disappearance acknowledged as significant. They wanted it remembered as unresolved, not forgotten. They wanted the truth, even if incomplete, to replace speculation. Years passed again. The case did not suddenly break open. There was no dramatic reveal, no courtroom moment, no public confession. What changed was something subtler. The silence lost its power. The story was written down, the timeline preserved, the family's voice recorded in official files and public records. The case became part of Tulsa's documented history, not just a private wound. And that mattered more than many people realize. Because cold cases do not only belong to police departments. They belong to families, to communities, to history. Every unresolved case leaves a mark, not just on those who lost someone, but on the places where the truth remains unknown. Tulsa carries that mark. Not loudly, not visibly, but quietly, in the way unresolved stories always do. The family continues to live with unanswered questions. They have learned to exist without closure, without certainty, without endings. They have also learned that persistence itself is a form of justice. Because forgetting is easy, remembering takes effort. And sometimes, remembrance is the only resolution time allows.